What does Prototype look like? Is he really that huge? His hand became a symbol of true evil in Poppy Playtime, but what does evil actually look like? Prototype, the main antagonist of the game whose face we still don't know. However, some details give us a tiny bit of insight into this villain. What could he actually look like? It's not just a long, clawed hand. Clearly, there's some body behind it. So far, he's one of the most mysterious Poppy Playtime characters and one of the cleverest. He clearly has a plan and sticks to it with precision. It feels like we're in Prototype's game and everything is going according to his plan. When necessary, he's even willing to sacrifice his most loyal minion despite having prayed for him for a long time. We're left to wonder, is he really so huge, powerful and strong that practically all monsters fear him? Even those who align with him are afraid, probably due to great fear, not knowing what to expect from a monster whose face we still don't know. And yet, he's the one responsible for the hour of joy in the plot. How Prototype evolved, or rather, how the information about him changed as we progressed from chapter to chapter. I noticed a pattern. At the end of each chapter, we find a cassette discussing Prototype. In the first chapter, after Huggy Wuggy falls, we find the last cassette mentioning Experiment 1006. At that time, we speculated about whom it could be referring to, and many, including myself, thought it might be about Huggy Wuggy, as he was the only monster we had encountered. We couldn't predict who awaited us next. No one even paid attention to the image on the cassette, which displayed a hand. In fact, the first image of Prototype we saw was in the first chapter of Poppy Playtime. The mysterious scientist, presumably Dr. Harley Sawyer, makes the final recording about Experiment 1006. He immediately highlights its main skills, coordination and collaboration, which are also observed in other experiments of its kind. What specific type of experiment is implied is unknown. It could be all monsters, or perhaps intelligent monsters like Prototype or Poppy Doll, and there's no doubt she's smart. What's interesting is that no one killed her. She was placed in some room, then kidnapped, and again not killed, as if she's needed for something. Anyway, the skills outlined in the cassette could have been used by Prototype for the hour of joy, and the recording itself, judging by the screams in the background, was made at the moment of this terrifying event in the company. However, even these horrors didn't make the scientist doubt his intentions, as he wants to continue these experiments and simply avoid previous mistakes. In the second chapter, Prototype's first appearance occurs. Let's remember our first emotions when we first saw him, a mysterious monster appearing out of nowhere, sparking a bunch of questions about who he was and what he wanted, how he was connected to everything in Poppy Playtime. We get some explanations. And what was that hand more clearly depicted here than in the first chapter? Perhaps the same Harley Sawyer made this recording, sharing his observations. On that day, Prototype almost escaped. He disassembled the alarm clock in his room and used the battery along with other components to make a laser pointer with which he attempted to escape. Using the laser pointer, he disabled the surveillance camera in his cell, but as soon as the camera turned on, the room with Prototype turned out to be empty, and as soon as they entered to check on him, he immediately tried to slip through the open door. Here, the scientist concludes about Prototype's excellent intellect. He can not only devise plans, but is also a good inventor and constructor. From this recording, we first understand how ingenious Prototype is, and since he was under surveillance, most likely in the next chapter, we'll get these recordings and find out what Prototype actually looks like. From this second chapter, a new theory emerges. That Prototype is assembling a new body for himself. After all, Mommy Longlegs, the main antagonist of the second chapter, told us that he would make her part of himself, but for what, we still don't know exactly. What happened to Prototype afterward? Is he really bodiless and assembling a new body? Or maybe he just wants to make himself stronger by using the abilities of other monsters. For now, it remains a mystery why he's doing all this, but we know one thing: he's making them part of himself. In the third chapter, in the penultimate cassette, we're given a whole dialogue between Prototype and the scientist Harley Sawyer. His name is no longer hidden, possibly indicating he's responsible for all the experiments. But the most interesting thing turned out to be Prototype himself. The image, by the way, is exactly the same as on the cassette from the second chapter. During the experiments on him, some problems clearly arose. Prototype stubbornly refuses to cooperate and likely remains inactive, as if protesting against the experiments. But as soon as our doctor wants to end the recording, Prototype starts speaking. He directly asks the scientist, "Why are you doing all this?" To which the scientist responds, "There's a secret in you that I'll uncover. Whether by force or not, you'll start talking to us, but I'll get what I want. Every day I learn more and more about you." Prototype repeats his phrase, as if referring to scientists and people. "I also learn more and more about you." Moreover, as we hear, Prototype speaks with different voices, suggesting that eventually he has already used his voice imitation ability. Remember the mysterious caller who appeared out of nowhere and called us, then suddenly disappeared as soon as Prototype killed Catnap? But that's another story. So it turns out that we're learning more and more about Prototype, even though we haven't seen him. However, what he might look like and what his face is like? No one has leaked Prototype's face anywhere, and we've never seen it. We know only his hand. It's just a hand. How his hand looks. This was figured out a year and a half ago. At least other theorists and reviewers did. Many paid attention to his human bone. It's quite an interesting detail in his body. As we know, other experiments were done with people who agreed to be test subjects. In some cases, like with Catnap, it was forced. A monster was made out of a child. But how did Prototype appear? This toy factory didn't just happen to have monsters. They appeared thanks to the big body program suggested by Dr. Harley Sawyer. Perhaps he created Prototype, and he turned out not just to be a monster, but rather intelligent and cunning. But if among the company's employees there was a volunteer who sacrificed himself to be turned into Prototype, the bone in his hand clearly hints at it. In the third chapter, we saw his hand a little more, but for now, it doesn't tell us anything, except that Prototype is indeed huge. He stuck his long arm into the hatch to take Catnap with him. Probably we'll keep fixating on this bone in his hand. I think we don't need to. Pay attention to how complete his hand looks. It's all robotic, meaning Prototype has the same robotic body. Everything is in wires, in some kind of machinery, and maybe with parts of some monsters he managed to gather. We're interested in his face. I can speculate that it's just as robotic, like the endoskeletons of animatronics. Or maybe if we pay attention again to the bone in his hand, we can also assume that his face is a huge skull. Maybe a real human one entwined with wires. Or it could be metal like Terminator. Or maybe he doesn't have a face or head at all. Yet, why guess when we already have a rough idea of Prototype? I'm talking about the altar Catnap built. He prayed specifically to him, and look at how this altar looks. It's built as if in the form of a figure with at least 2 big hands and consists of a bunch of monsters. And as we know, Prototype collects bodies. So Prototype could very well look like this. A huge endoskeleton with parts of monster bodies he assembled. But I don't think Prototype looks exactly like that. It could just be an altar made in the shape of Prototype from various things. Well, toys and monsters included. We could see similar horror at the very beginning, only there were just pierced and bloody toys. So there could be as many assumptions about Prototype's appearance as you want. Well, what do you think Prototype really looks like? Write your opinion in the comments.